Lila from Sochi. A night that smelled like the sea. It seems to me every story in Sochi begins with the smell of the sea. Even if you swear you've gotten used to it, that the whisper of waves is your eternal neighbor, there are still evenings when the salty air becomes the main character. And on one of those evenings, I went out to the promenade without a goal, just to listen to the pebbles grinding in the surf, and caught his gaze on me. Before I go on, I'll say something important. We were both adults, free people who understood perfectly well what we were doing. And perhaps the most important thing in this story isn't the details, which there won't be, but how sometimes the city gathers two random trajectories into a single point and makes a night you can't forget. How it all began. It was late August, the season when Sochi breathes more softly than in July, and the sunsets grow richer and more layered. I was walking along the Primorskaya embankment from the seaport toward Riviera, barefoot, sandals in hand. There was a trace of jasmine in the air, and the wind was warm as a palm. He was leaning on the railing, shoulder to the parapet, reading something on his phone. I didn't notice him at once. First I noticed a shadow, long, stretched, angled by the lamplight. Then, the look. He lifted his eyes the moment I turned to look at the lights on the yachts. As if we surfaced in sync. "Is it very noisy today?" he asked, nodding toward the sea. "That's not noise. That's conversation," I said. He smiled. And we walked together, without agreements and without plans. Sometimes that's easier than exchanging names. I knew little about him, and it was enough later I did learn his name was Andrei, that he'd flown in from Moscow for a couple of days to change the wallpaper around his head, that he loved moist apple pies and had an old film camera he carried to have a conversation with time. I liked that phrasing. "And you?" he asked. "I'm Lila. I live here. I work with texts, and sometimes I sit on the pier until sentences assemble themselves into lines," I answered. We stopped by the stairs that lead down to the pebbles. Someone below was singing "Guarding You from Harm" to a guitar, and somehow that became a bridge between us. Sometimes it's not about the words, but the air around the words. A calf with golden outlines. We wandered into a small calf past the Kostinsky Bridge that always smelled of mint and lemon. There were round wooden tables that your elbows stuck to, and bulbs under the ceiling like yellow berries. We ordered thyme tea and meadowvik. The conversation flowed free, without banks. I told him how the city turns glossy after a downpour and how in October the tea plantations above Dagames change their scent. He told me how sometimes in Moscow he wanted to stop in the middle of the night on the third ring road just to stare at the empty striped lanes. We laughed at silly coincidences. We had the same favorite lines by Tsvetiva. Both of us had a childhood fear of deep water, and we both hated cutting cake. Better to take a spoon from the edge than ruin the pattern with a knife. "You know," he said, "your voice is exactly how I imagined the sea would sound if it spoke in words." I kept quiet. There are compliments best answered with silence. Rain on Korotny. When we stepped outside, the city was already gleaming. A warm rain started without warning. We hid under the overhang of an old building on Korotny Prospect, stood close, and it felt like our breaths were falling into the same rhythm. The plane trees' leaves trembled, the few cars whispered with their tires on wet asphalt, and the streetlights smeared into golden blotches. He took off his light jacket and put it over my shoulders. And I suddenly realized this was a very simple, very right scene. Rain, the city, two adults who today owed nothing to time. "My place is not far," I said. "My cat doesn't mind guests, tried and tested." We laughed. And we went. A home that smells of books and salt. I live on the third floor of an old building where the stairwell smells of warm stone and orange peel. The neighbor dries garlands of rind. There are always a couple of damp towels in my kitchen because I don't close the windows. I like it when the salty air doesn't ask permission. The cat came to meet us with a dignified air, circled Andrei, and, with a satisfied huff, allowed himself to be petted. That meant a lot. My cat learned to read people better than I did long ago. We put the kettle on. While the water heated, I pulled my wet hair into a tight braid. He examined the postcards on the fridge, old Kinotava posters, snapshots from the Lastochka train, photos of misty tea terraces. On the windowsill, shells, one of them looking like a smirking eye. "You live like someone who has silence," he said. "Sometimes. But more often wind, I replied. We drank tea and listened to the rain fade. And suddenly everything felt very calm, like those moments when you know for sure you're not in a hurry and you are exactly where you're meant to be. How we decided to stay, we didn't rush to labels, didn't pretend to be someone else, didn't play expectation games. The words aligned themselves, simple, honest. He brushed my fingers on the mug, asked with his eyes, "May I?" And in that question there was more respect and tenderness than I could explain. When he kissed me, I thought, sometimes the world turns clear the way it does after a long rain, every contour rinsed clean, colors restored to themselves. We were quiet, and then we laughed in whispers. I said yes, and in that yes there was no daring, no bravado, only a free choice. What came next should stay behind a closed door. It was just the two of us, very adult, very alive, very attentive to each other. No rush, no stories for other ears. And that was the main truth of that night. Morning with a view of the sea, I woke before him, the sun had only just touched the windowsill, and the cat had settled at my feet like a warm comma. I stepped out onto the balcony, and the city smiled, wet leaves glistened, the sea gathered light into itself, and seagulls drew circles as if by compass. André followed, wrapped an arm around my shoulders. We stood and drank coffee from thick cups, warming our hands. And it was clear we weren't going to promise each other the impossible. Some days are good precisely because they don't have to continue. They just happen and stay with you like music you can hum to yourself when you need it. "I'll take the Lastochka around noon," he said. "I'll walk you to the seaport," I replied. We got ready without fuss. The cat gave him a stern look, nodded in approval, and went to sleep on the windowsill. Parting without drama, we walked along the promenade where bright towels were already spread out and the smell of corn from a cart mixed with the cologne of passing tourists. I bought him water, he bought me a magnet with a seagull, the same as the one on my old fridge. A silly symbol, but it felt warm. We stopped by the seaport. He took my hands, and I saw in his eyes the same calm that was in mine, gratitude. Not promises, not pretense, not plans that inevitably break. Just thank you for the night, for the city, for our time aligning. "Lila," he said. "If I ever want to talk to the sea in words again, I'll know where to find it. And I'll know where to find conversations with time," I answered. We hugged. Not tightly, not desperately, like people whose insides are exactly where they should be. What remained after I walked home slowly? On the pier someone was drying nets, kids were skipping stones, a woman on a bench was feeding pigeons. I slipped off my sandals and walked over the pebbles to the water. It was cool, clear, and for a second I thought the sea winked. At home, the cat stretched like a yoga textbook and demanded a late breakfast. I opened my laptop, clicked new document, and for the first time in a long while the words came on their own and sat down beside me. Maybe because sometimes we're assembled not by meanings but by meetings. Sometimes the city gives you a night to return you to yourself. I don't know where André is now. Maybe somewhere at Mayakovskaya station he got out on the wrong foot because he missed a train, or Hez standing in line for a croissant and scolding himself for it. Maybe Hez developing black and white film, and in one of the squares is our rainy Kurortny prospect with its blurred lights. But I know this. In the evening, when the sun slips behind the mountains past Adler, I'll go out to the promenade again, breathe in jasmine and salt. And if I meet the gaze of someone who doesn't hear the noise of the sea but its conversation, I'll smile. Because in Sochi all stories have one voice. And sometimes that voice speaks with your own mouth.